George Russell has been warned to respect the seniority of Lewis Hamilton within the Mercedes team after the recent occurrences at the Japanese Grand Prix. Russell, showing clear speed advantage in the initial laps, repeatedly tried to pass his teammate. However, at the Spoon corner, Hamilton pushed Russell off the track, prompting the young British driver to express his concerns over the team radio. In response, Mercedes opted to create distance between their cars on the track by bringing in Hamilton for the initial of the two planned pit stops. Russell was then switched to a one-stop strategy, which meant he would be navigating the closing laps of the race with older tires. As expected, Hamilton began to narrow the gap to his teammate with less than 5 laps remaining, but the 7-time world champion faced some initial difficulty in overtaking Russell, even though he had significantly fresher tires. Mercedes instructed George to make way for Hamilton, but Russell asked them to delay the move until the final lap, as this would have shielded him from the approaching Ferrari of Sainz. The change was eventually executed on the following lap, and 2 laps later, Sainz easily overtook Russell, who was struggling with his deteriorating tires. Many F1 observers raised questions about Mercedes' choice to make George yield, as the current on-track positions would have resulted in an extra 2 points for the team. After the checkered flag, Russell openly criticized Mercedes for what he deemed the worst strategy. The British driver also questioned his team's decision-making, asking why the team didn't try to optimize their points by instructing Hamilton to support him and prevent Sainz from passing. George voiced these complaints to the media, saying, "The 3-stop was closer, or faster, than the 1-stop was. When you're in the car, 48 laps in, giving it everything, trying to make a suboptimal strategy work, that radio is a tool to release frustration. Overtaking was difficult. You saw Piastri with much fresher tires. He didn't fly by. It took him 2 laps, and he only just achieved it. It's easy in hindsight." Hamilton, on the other hand, sees things differently and criticized Russell for not yielding to him sooner. He said, "We should have swapped around earlier, and I should have got as far ahead as possible to keep the gap as big as I could to the Ferrari." Russell joined the Mercedes team the season after Hamilton narrowly missed winning the F1 driver's title in the last lap of the final Grand Prix of the 2021 season. In 2022, George secured the team's sole pole position and race victory, outscoring Hamilton by 35 points in the Drivers' Championship. This year, Russell has struggled to match Hamilton's performance and has only secured a single podium finish in 16 races. To be fair, his performance has seen a resurgence since the summer break, with George out-qualifying Lewis 3 times out of 4 in the previous Grand Prix events, and had it not been for the mistake in Singapore, Russell would have had a podium finish ahead of his teammate. But former F1 driver Anthony Davidson, who also serves as a Mercedes simulator driver, believes that George Russell should recognize his role within the team, with Hamilton being the senior figure who has earned his status as the top driver. Davidson shared this perspective during an appearance on the Sky Sports F1 podcast. "There's definitely a hierarchy in that team, and rightly so. You know, Lewis has earned that status in that team as a 7-time world champion, and George can't argue against that. George is still the understudy, and he's doing a very good job on those occasions where he's got the speed over Lewis to really take the fight to him." Mercedes is currently facing challenges as they have lost their dominant position to Red Bull. Hamilton has been vocal about his concerns regarding the team's technical department's rigid stance, which insists that their car concepts are sound and simply need further development and refinement. Some critics argue that Mercedes is increasingly favoring Hamilton, almost to the point of making him an unofficial number 1 driver, which could hinder their ability to plan for the future. But Davidson believes that there will be a genuine competitive rivalry between the Mercedes drivers moving forward. He said, "Russell knows he's got the speed. We all see it as well from the outside. Lewis is getting his elbows out when he needs to. I'm really intrigued by this battle, and watching George develop as a driver, and watching Lewis in his latter years in his career. Watching this young, hard-charging driver in George, really threatening him for speed and consistency, and it's great to watch Lewis getting stuck in as well." Other people have been seeing the tension growing in Mercedes too. Formula One correspondent Lawrence Barretto said that George Russell couldn't successfully carry out his one-stop strategy during the Japanese Grand Prix, as he was lured into the top-dog battle with Lewis Hamilton, ultimately affecting his race plan. Barretto discussed this on the F1 Strategy Report, saying, "I think execution is to blame massively. I think George Russell is in an interesting spot at the minute. He's obviously come off the Singapore Grand Prix, and he had that mistake that cost him a podium. He's obviously not performed as strongly relative to Lewis Hamilton this year, and that will irritate him frankly. And I think then, you go into races like this, where Mercedes are kind of in that weird realm of probably the fourth best team, just behind Ferrari and McLaren, and therefore, if you want to have a bit of excitement, you probably have to try something different. So, I can see why George would have probably been very pro on the one-stop. But the thing is, as I mentioned, with his fight with Lewis, I think it's just a racing driver mentality that you're with Lewis and you're battling him, and the sensible thing to actually beat him is not to fight him. I know that sounds really silly, but execution, that was the thing to do, and he just couldn't resist it, because I think there was also that internal battle between who is top dog in that team. And so, I suppose George has to prove two things. He has to prove that he is the future for that team. He's the driver that they should be backing already now, even though they've got a 7-time world champion in the other car. But also, he has to get the best result. And I think often, particularly in this scenario, you can't prove both those things in one go. Or you prove it by executing the strategy that you said you were going to do, and that is how the team view it. You know, you've thought about this race. But at the moment, because George has had such a difficult season and a frustrating season, I'm kind of not surprised that he just couldn't resist fighting Lewis. And because of that, I don't know exactly how hard he would have pushed the tires, but he almost certainly would have pushed it to the point where I don't think he would have run out of them effectively as quickly as he did in this Grand Prix, if he hadn't fought Lewis, and then he might have been in a better spot. I mean, it's all ifs, what maybes, but I think that he didn't execute that race, and I think that when he goes back and he looks at it, that will be the greatest frustration I think from that Grand Prix. Mercedes attempted to employ a team strategy in the final stages at Suzuka, requesting that Hamilton, after Russell had yielded, maintain a close enough distance to Russell to keep him within the DRS range, thereby aiding him in defending against Sainz. But given Russell's deteriorating tires, this plan did not yield the expected results, and Barretto expressed his surprise that Mercedes even attempted it. He said, "I didn't really understand the whole DRS thing, because George's tires, even with DRS, he was always going to be at risk, even if Lewis was helping him. So all you're really doing is risking Lewis, who would have been comfortable if they just let them race anyway, because he had, I think, a 2-second gap before he had to drop back into George's DRS. So you're actually putting the wider team at risk by doing that, for what could potentially be obviously a bigger gain if you do keep both cars behind. The Ferrari was fundamentally a very fast race car anyway, so it was already going to be a difficult feat to achieve. So yeah, it wasn't desperation, but it did feel like they just rolled the dice a little bit in a scenario where they just ultimately didn't really need to. What do you think? Has George Russell been disrespecting the hierarchy over at Mercedes, or does he have a right to equal treatment? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for the hottest F1 news.